I want to create a parallel between Eric Zemmour and Dmitry Galkovsky. So, Eric Zemmour is a Jewish, French, far-right commentator, and Dmitry Galkovsky is a Russian. I don't know if I would call him a commentator. He's a novelist, he's a blogger, he's a gamer, and he's been around since the 1980s. What's interesting to me, firstly, about Zemmour, he has basically come neck and neck, and in some cases, some projections would say that because Marine Le Pen is the established far-right candidate for France, that because he's polling neck and neck with her, he's probably going to pull ahead. And we'll see if he gets drafted for that and overtakes Marine Le Pen. But it's an interesting case because the Front National in France is supposed to be an anti-Semitic party. Eric Zemmour is Jewish. So what's going on here? I'm trying to create a connection with Dmitry Galkovsky because Dmitry Galkovsky looks at two things that I look at pretty frequently. He looks at ethnicity and he looks at minoritarianism. And so Dmitry Galkovsky looks at the creation of the Soviet ethnicity, not a Russian ethnicity, not any others, but this kind of Soviet ethnicity of people who were mixed together in the Soviet Union. And he looks at the function of ethnic minoritarianism in the Soviet Union, that Russia never really had a truly, just a leader, or excuse me, Soviet Union never had a Russian leader in an ethnic sense. Stalin was Georgian, I believe Khrushchev was Ukrainian, and Brezhnev. And so, Lenin as well, none of these people were just classically ethnically Russian, which is the largest ethnicity in Russia. Statistically speaking, how could that possibly happen? The same thing with Eric Zemmour, not just statistically speaking, but almost logically speaking. How is it that the Front National and the far right in France and Europe generally, which is associated with anti-Semitism, how is it that a Jewish Frenchman is now possibly going to be leading it in the next elections? We'll have to see. I mean, this could be completely off base. But it's a very interesting question to look at. And with regard to Galkovsky, I just want to make a note that I think if we look at him quantitatively, if we look at everything he said and just do a true-false analysis and add up the marks and come out with some score, that's not going to be very valuable. But instead to look qualitatively and ask, what are the outliers here? What are the aspects of Galkovsky that make him stand out? And what's the importance of that? Galkovsky has made a number of famous predictions about the Polish leadership being violently attacked. He's made predictions about the Ukrainian civil war before similar events took place in the Maidan. So these are interesting outliers. These are things that, he said publicly on his blog, that it's hard to not see some kind of prophetic quality to that. And when Galkovsky basically arranges this theory of Russia, which is extremely minoritarian, where he says that Russia has never really been controlled by ethnic Russians, at least not during the Soviet period for the last, 70 years. And additionally, in the post-Soviet period, it's still not controlled by ethnic Russians. And he says that, in fact, one of the great influencers on the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet Russian Federation has been Britain, that there has been a power struggle between the United States and Britain. He says this because he says that the United States and Britain are the two preeminent powers of the world, and so like Sparta and Athens, or like Greece and Persia, or Rome and Parthia, that the two greatest powers are always subordinating other conflicts to a kind of proxy status. This is his theory. And it's very, I guess you could say, essentializing or reductionist, right? To state that everything is just Britain versus America. And it also sounds ridiculous, because Britain and America, they both speak English. They should be on the same side. They should be on the same team. Spangler has his own version of this, which is the Prussian versus the Viking. That the Prussian and the Viking are essentially both two very closely related Germanic groups, but that they represent opposed tendencies. And for Spangler, this goes deeply into philosophy and economics and the attitude toward life, the attitude toward law and order and commerce and duty and morality. For Galkovsky, I honestly couldn't tell you how deep that analysis goes. And I'm not even sure if he's concerned in it, because Spangler is writing from the perspective of someone identifying with the Prussian tradition, saying that I'm on this side of this dichotomy. Whereas for Galkovsky, he is essentially stating that the Russian people are captive. They are captive of other ethnicities. They are captive of the global American empire, of the global British empire, and that the Russian people are kind of a puppet to be used in a proxy war between these powers. And so some people would say this is an incredibly fatalistic view of the world, and we could say it goes too far, we could say it's ridiculous, but I think the spirit of the idea is interesting, at least as a thought experiment, and he's remarked many times that that is how his writing should be considered. Now, we could ask if, given certain controversial statements, if he's not saying that to simply cover himself, but at least let's open the possibility that these things are not meant to be taken purely in a literal sense, although there may be some truth to the idea that Britain saw, for example, and this, what Galkovsky essentially says is that the British used the Soviet Union as a hedge against America. That's a little bit far afield from my perspective, which would be something closer to Britain did in fact use the Soviet Union at various times as a hedge against Germany. That Britain has always tried to play off different continental European powers against each other. And so at various times, Britain did support the Soviet Union to oppose Germany, right? And so in that sense, you could say the Soviet Union was a proxy for Germany. Now, I typically view Britain and America as having very similar interests and basically working together toward that goal at various points, that they wanted to both contain Germany by promoting the Soviet Union via economic assistance, intelligence assistance, sending over trucks, sending over engineers, sending over loans, sending over fuel. So, I mean, and I still do basically believe that to an extent. We also have to look at the sense in which Lenin was a German agent. This is something that Galkovsky writes about, and I'm not sure where it fits into his chronology. It does, for me, it is also a big transition point where the German Empire sees Lenin and communism as a way to disrupt Russia's participation in the Great War. And to an extent that is successful, but ultimately not successful enough because you have the intervention of America. So there's a question there to go deeper in, at what point does British influence start and end versus the German influence? what is the character of communism? Is communism a tool of the British? Is it a tool of the Germans? Well, in some sense, I think it verifiably was a tool of the Germans. But at what point does it stop being a tool of the Germans and start becoming a tool of the British? So this is all very complicated, and we can agree or disagree, but in general, I think opening up the possibility that communists, like this, the one interpretation of the Soviet Union is that it's basically Russian imperialism, that Soviet communism is a secularization of the Russian imperial throne, and it's a form of neo-colonialism because, you're forcing all of these foreign peoples to learn Russian. In the same way that people would say that, Africans and Chinese and South Americans or whoever Europeans being forced to learn English is a form of neo-colonialism. But Galkovsky sees it in the opposite way. He sees that, there is a colonialism going on, but in learning the Russian language, it's not those foreign people who are primarily colonized, although they are colonized in a secondary sense, but primarily what's happening is Russian culture is being confused, it is being disoriented, it is being inundated with a new type of unrootedness. That there for Galkovsky, there is a clear sort of person, there's a clear sort of culture, there's a real ethnicity there. But in everybody being Russified, this and to the extent that Russification is unsuccessful, right? And theoretically, we could think of an ethnogenesis where this is successful, where this takes place in a practical way. But if it is half-hearted, if it is a half measure and it is not complete, then we have a problem. We have a problem because we have a lot of people who are now speaking Russian, who are participating, and Galkovsky is very focused on the Russian literary tradition. We have people participating in the Russian literary tradition who are, in a sense, confused, opposed, hostile, disoriented to the people and the culture of the language they are speaking. And that's something that I think can be applied to what's happening with the English language right now, and to the sort of, Anglo-Saxon ethnic, the WASP, on a lower class level, the people who have the greatest association to the English tradition, who don't really have an alternative, for whom it is native in the truest sense, are in some ways the most alienated from the highest levels of English literary criticism. And so Galkovsky is I don't know if he notes the parallel, but I'm noting the parallel between Galkovsky's view of the spread of Russian culture as a dilution of Russian culture, as an inversion of Russian culture, and what's going on in the English-speaking world. And I want to tie that together with Eric Zemmour, who is this French Jewish Berber. And so he's a foreigner, in a sense, to French culture. In other senses, he's a native to French culture. So again, it's this kind of confusion. And here we're looking at this kind of subculture, political subculture of the far right in France, which is not necessarily a majority, but it is rather large compared to certain other far right parties in Europe. Whether we're talking about in Britain, you would have, I suppose, the BNP or the Brexit Party or something like that. In Hungary, they used to have Jobbik, and in Germany, it would be AfD. So we have various far-right parties, and I don't really think any of them technically do as well as the Front National. I guess we could quibble about that, the difference between, local and national or whatever, but that's generally my belief, and I'm happy to be corrected. But it is interesting to take this principle that Galkovsky talks about and that I'm trying to extend through this minoritarian lens, that you have some kind of majority-based culture, whether it's the Russian culture or the WASP, Anglo-Saxon or whatever. You have kind of like the country itself, whether it's America, Britain, or Russia. It's like these are the common people. This is the majority ethnicity. And you take that language and you take that culture and you take that grouping and you sort of expand it to include other people, but not truly bringing them into the center, but always forcing them to remain on the periphery. You're never really erasing. I'll give an example in the German case, that if you look historically at Germany, the Drang nach Osten, the push to the east, that Germany at certain points, and there's a very ancient history in Europe of language families and how they move about. At one point, the Romans mapped Germania as going into Poland. After the Huns and the Alans and the Bulgars and the Magyars and the Mongols even pushed through Russia, and they pushed all those other ethnicities into Europe, into Southeast Europe, which had been Illyrian, which had been Greek, which had been, Scythian perhaps. In any case, these people were pushed, and the Germans were pushed from Poland to what we consider today West Germany. And so there was a point at which East Germany was Slavic. Berlin was a Slavic settlement, not a city at that point. And over the centuries, through the kingdom set up by Charlemagne and his descendants, the Germans eventually colonized and pushed eastward, and with the Teutonic Knights and Christianization, they fought against their own German pagans, but also the Slavic pagans, in their own crusades, not in the Middle East, but in Europe. And they Germanized those areas. And was it necessarily the case that they were simply genociding people, wiping them out, killing women and children, treating them like Amalekites? No, not necessarily. And some of the place names are suggestive even of earlier Germanization of the south of Celtic areas. And there might be some kind of other evidence we could look at for the assimilation, intermixing, and whatnot. But there is not today, as a result of that, perhaps you could say it's because of the time that's passed, there is not this distinction between perhaps those Germans who are from areas or even descended from Celts or Slavs as opposed to a more Scandinavian orientation. Does not really exist that, except in some kind of, I guess you could say some kind of phenotypic schema that you could apply. But outside of, I guess you'd say nose measuring schemes or something, what they call calipers, outside of, sort of caliper-esque measurement, people don't take these sorts of distinctions as having real ethnic meaning in terms of identity, that you are more or less of a German depending on some kind of Slavic or Celtic admixture. Not to say that those theories haven't been a part of the far right or haven't been existent, but it's just not something that the average person takes. And I don't think it's really been something that the average person has ever really strictly taken, even though everyone has a stereotype of, the stereotypical German, the stereotypical Russian, the stereotypical whatever. We've always had those sort of stereotypes. The British are actually famous for kind of trying to create national stereotypes for all different kinds of people. But I'm getting far afield. The point is that the Germanization process as a kind of ethnogenesis, or we have to have another, because it wasn't the creation of a German identity, but it was the integration of different peoples into the German identity completely, where there was no remaining concept of, we're kind of German, but not really. And there were some ethnicities, I'm forgetting the one that's on the border with Poland, and the Sorbians. The Sorbians were not absorbed into this wider Germanic identity, and they maintained a Slavic language, a Slavic identity, but a very small group. What Galkovsky is saying is that you can have a situation where the assimilation and integration process is not really directed, at least in the time frame we're looking at, it is not directed toward real cohesion, but rather it increases conflict. It does not unite people under a single identity or a single banner, but it actually increases conflict by taking disparate, separate peoples who originally had their own kind of cultural zone and perhaps had a military or bodily conflict or a territorial conflict with one another, that they had borders and such, but because those have been erased through the promulgation of a lingua franca, a common language, that all of those people have been brought together and integrated hierarchically into a caste system, which Galkovsky sees that the majority ethnic Russians are at the bottom of this caste system in some sense, that they are not really allowed or promoted at the top of it, and he blames Soviet communism on much of that, but he says that it was existed in other periods and other times. And for Galkovsky, this is, writing from an ethnic Russian perspective, this is a negative phenomenon for him. It's interesting to look at that as a cultural whole on this macro scale of you have the entire Russian culture and it's being structured in such a way as to disprivilege ethnic Russians and to create classes of people who are fundamentally 1 foot in, 1 foot out of Russian culture at all times. It's a seemingly unique status, but I think it actually appears very frequently in the English-speaking world, and I think it appears with Eric Zemmour, where he is clearly on the far right. And yet, also, I think the reason why he's succeeding is because of his Jewishness, because he is outside, in a certain sense, of the far right, that no one can accuse him of being anti-Semitic. I think Ben Shapiro enjoys this to an extent in America. As a parallel, people have called Zemmour the French Ben Shapiro, although I would say that their rhetoric differs significantly. But it's not, for me, none of this is really a critique. I mean, we can understand the moralistic centers that people use to analyze these dynamics. But we can also understand this analysis in an objective sense that, we can see this as fundamentally disadvantageous depending on our social position. But we can also just understand it as a historical process and try to understand the incentives and reasons why. Why doesn't Eric Zemmour look like he's going to take over the far right in France? Why is the phenomenon that Galkovsky describes of this kind of inverted caste system, why does that happen? And is that due to British influence, right? What is the role of international superpowers, what Spangler called the Atlanticist powers? What is their role? I think Galkovsky also gives us an answer to the other Russian philosopher Dugin with his fourth political theory, which I've always just dismissed as trying to take the concept of sovereignty and reify it on a civilizational scale. And, looking at someone like Galkovsky, I think that idea falls apart as a type of a shadow, as a type of propaganda, as a kind of wishful thinking, as a kind of mask or a screen for what's actually going on. So, he has his Eurasianist idea. He wants to promote the Eurasian civilization, the Eurasian ideal. And because he sees that ideal as being hemmed in by Atlanticist neocolonialism, he says, well, I'm not in favor of neocolonialism. But he is in favor of a type of Eurasianist colonialism where it can be applied, but he justifies it through, well, this is the traditional Eurasianist space. But I'm sure once that would be achieved, what would stop it from going further? Would they would be good little Eurasianists and they would confine themselves to their space. I mean, it is a kind of pragmatic formulation that tries to distinguish itself from nationalism by speaking on the scale of civilizations. But I don't find it very interesting. I don't find it very compelling. Galkovsky, by contrast, rather than seeing the world as broken up into these physical, geopolitical territories, or even geographical territories that we can describe things in this continental way, he's focused on the influence of countries like America and Britain on Russia. And so he's very interested in transnational influence. He's interested in the ability of MI6 or Freemasons or small groups of people to influence things in faraway places. And I think that is a much more accurate picture of the world, even if in some senses Dugin is radically pragmatic in the worst way possible, right? Where he's just saying, we live in a multipolar world and this is how it is, and it's a great thing and we need to embrace it. It's a false pragmatism, I would say. That states, things simply, we just have to sort of accept things as they are on the surface and reinforce them. And we see the bias where that comes from. Whereas Galkovsky does not have this, I think, this sort of like straightforward, the world's headed in this good multipolar direction, this clearly biased thinking, this clearly, almost a Machiavellian thinking. Galkovsky unveils that Machiavellianism and he says, here's what's going on. He says it in a brutal way. He says it in a way, on an emotional sense, you get the feeling that Galkovsky is like a Schopenhauer, that he is trying to look at reality in a pessimistic way. And in that sense, like Chiron, he is to be trusted. At least intuitively, I trust him more because he's saying this is the worst possible case. Although we don't have to view it as the worst possible case, but in a sense, he's saying, from my position, this is a story that does not favor me. It does not glorify. It is not a self-aggrandizing thing. It is not a way of trying to moralize in my direction or to say, I'm on the winning team in history. It's saying that, we are, as Russian people, we are sort of controlled by international powers. This was, by the way, before the 1990s. Galkovsky was writing, but he was writing in the 80s, and as soon as the 90s came, it became very apparent to the Russian people that they were being controlled from abroad. You couldn't ignore internationally the influence that other countries like America or Britain or the Western powers were having on Russia at that time through the opening up of the Russian market and the foreign interests coming in. It was impossible to ignore. And so Galkovsky was writing in that vein before it even happened, which is another kind of prophetic aspect of him. And then it's almost as if he sort of anticipated the attitude of the public before it came. And then the public obviously saw that displayed to them, and they fell into agreement with Galkovsky in some sense. And the general Russian attitude, I mean, there's a history since the Russian Civil War. There's been a history of looking at Russia through this lens, through what I would call a minoritarian lens, and saying, the Russian people are this inert mass. They don't really understand what's going on. They don't have a sense of themselves. They're a bit confused, and it's only becoming more confusing. let's look at those groups of people who are jostling about with them in some degree of confusion and some degree of assurance. How are people manipulating events to create these political social outcomes? So I think it's very interesting. I could talk at length more about him, but I guess that's how I think we should look at an Eric Zemmour, is through this lens of minoritarianism, the introduction of an outsider from the periphery into the center of a group to which he does not quite belong. There's a kind of paradoxical irony that is, rather than being a weakness, actually seems to be a power. It seems to be a strength and a phenomenon internationally in many places at many times. So I hope you enjoyed. If you did, leave a like, leave a comment, share the video on Twitter or somewhere else. Follow me on Twitter at Jokull, Jokkull. I will get in contact with you. We can do a little video chatting. That's all for today. I will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Nice. Subscribe. Very good.
Nice. Beautiful.
Very good.
Beautiful. You're going to love it. If you love autism, you're going to love my channel. Okay, great.
All right.